So, our next session is on energy in 2013, and we will have three panelists: Marvin Odum, President of Shell Oil Company, Fred Krupp, President of the Environmental Defense Fund, and Christine Todd Whitman, co-chair of the Clean and Safe Energy Coalition and former governor of New Jersey. So first of all, for his prediction, Marvin Odum, President of Shell Oil Company, the US company of Shell.
Thank you, Daniel, and it's good to see everyone here. Thank you for having us. I can't start this conversation without taking a little bit of the space in terms of backdrop. So where is energy demand going? So I'll use part of my time to do that. This is a story that I think is probably familiar to most everyone in the room. The population going from 7 billion today up to 9 billion by the middle of this century, potentially doubling energy demand. Now, all those are huge numbers and they mean different things to different people. I'll tell you the one sort of phrase that's caught me, and that is that kind of growth up to 9 billion people is the equivalent of creating a new city of 1 million people every week for the next 30 years. So when you think about the energy that's consumed by a city of 1 million people, imagine that type of growth in energy. So the question very much becomes, not so much is there enough energy, but how are we going to supply that level of energy demand around the world? So you see these emerging economies, you see them becoming energy consumers for the first time. We know we have 1.5 billion people that aren't even consuming energy today that are trying to move into that space. So the prediction of where energy is going is an enormous increase. Then you think about the environmental stresses that come along with that. And so we at Shell, and particularly through our scenario work, are doing a lot of interaction with other companies and thought provokers around what we call the Stress Nexus. That's the intersection between food, water, and energy, and the fact that these are very much connected, and trying to sort out, how we take these interconnected elements and have a positive impact them over the coming decades. So that's a big macro backdrop, if you will. A couple other quick points I'll make. You can look at what's happening in North America, and you can call it somewhat of an energy revolution. The amount of natural gas that's been found in the country now, all sorts of news reports around additional oil supplies and these unconventional shale resources. I use the word revolution intently because it is having an amazing impact on this country. You hear the IEA starting to talk about self-sufficiency for the US now, or for the continent at least. So it is changing this dynamic. It has potential impacts on geopolitics, on the choices companies are making, on the choices that countries are making. So I'd be happy to go deeper into that piece. But if you broaden out from North America and then take that same picture, one of the big questions for us now is, will that revolution that we've seen in North America be replicated in other parts of the world? With one of the first big questions out there being around China. As China is now exploring, and actually we're helping China explore for these natural gas resources and other resources. So that potentially has enormous impacts on where the world goes. I think I'll just cycle all the way back down to the specific topic of renewables. So again, just kind of setting up for a conversation here. Our personal view is renewables are critically important. Everything you will hear me say does actually fit into more or less an all of the above energy strategy, because we think that's what we need. Our prediction, if things go very, very well, is that renewables could supply somewhere on the order of 30% of the world's energy demand by the middle of this century. Now that would be growth that we haven't seen anywhere in the world in any source of energy before now, but if we do it the right way, that's possible. I'll stop there.
Great. Just a quick follow-up on that, because the 30%, it may sound like a small sum, but as you say, it's an enormous growth rate from a very low base now, would be, and absolutely in a growing energy environment. So which renewables in particular do you see having that sort of potential? Is it wind? Is it solar? Is it wave, geothermal? What is it?
Well, actually, to get to the kind of numbers I'm talking about, so you double energy demand in the world and then supply 30% of it from renewables coming from these, you say
it's
1
huge.
or 2%
Yeah.
now.
So where's it going to come from?
It takes everything. So I think certainly wind is part of that. PV solar is, there's some optimism that there's some breakthroughs potentially coming there. So I think, ultimately hydrogen may be on the table as part of that answer. I will, say all of these are important, all of these potentially fill some of that space, they all need additional technology applied to them, and we have to come down the cost curve. It's always interesting to look at what we as a company do, and I'll tell you that our focus right now, when it comes to the emission space and the idea of why we would push renewables, our focus is around carbon capture and storage, and it's around biofuels, particular types of biofuels that meet this low CO2 intensity standpoint. And then we have a wind business, but to be perfectly frank, it's not growing very fast.
Okay. We will, I hope, come back to this, but let's move on to our next prediction from Fred Krupp, who has for 28 years been head of the Environmental Defense Fund and has been a pioneer in advocating harnessing market forces for environmental ends. Fred.
Thank you. Well, in 2013, I predict that this country will finally begin a long overdue conversation about climate change, and that will lead EPA to put in place meaningful, common sense rules to reduce carbon pollution from the nation's biggest source of greenhouse gas pollution, which is our power plants. Hurricane Sandy wasn't caused by climate change, but it was made worse by climate change. The surge here in New York was higher because the oceans are higher. The winds of the hurricane were speedier because the oceans are warmer. And so we've got to attack power plants and reduce the carbon pollution from them, which not only causes climate change, but also things like asthma and cancer. We also have to attack fossil fuel subsidies. In my view, subsidies for the fossil fuel industry now outweigh renewable subsidies by 75 to 1. We've got to level the playing field so clean energy has a chance to compete. In the meantime, we've also got to increase R&D for clean energy and preserve the limited subsidies that we do have, such as the production tax credit for wind power. I also predict that 2013 will be the year when we begin to finally modernize our electric grid, which is incredibly antiquated. We saw again in Hurricane Sandy that a few places in New York City, like Co-op City, were able to become islands of power and keep their lights on, while other places, like NYU's hospital, had to evacuate patients. The reasons that more of the city wasn't resilient and able to keep the power on, again, is because of antiquated policies that we need to change. So that if you have solar panels on your house, not only should you be able to feed them into the grid, but when the grid goes down, you should be able to use them to keep the lights on. And all sorts of decentralized power production should be facilitated by the rules, not only here in New York State, but in all of our states. And I think this will be the year when we begin to get the policies in place to do exactly that.
Fred, I just want to ask you quickly on, you mentioned Sandy a couple of times. An event like Sandy, what sort of impact does that have on the, if you like, your members and the interest and engagement in the sorts of issues that you're involved in?
Well, I don't think I can overstate how much it galvanized people. I think people saw an opening to talk about this issue that had been swept under the rug by politicians and others. Neither the president nor Romney talked about climate change during the election. Suddenly, people began to talk about the issue, which was good. Mayor Bloomberg here based his endorsement on the president in part on climate change. So I think the storm, the prolonged drought affecting our nation's crops, they don't change everything. It doesn't mean we've won the battle, but they do open up a conversation from which we can begin to make the changes that we desperately need to make.
Good. Well, again, we'll come back to issues around that, but let's hear the last set of predictions from Governor Whitman, who was, of course, the head of EPA under George W. Bush. and also prior to that, the 50th governor of the state of New Jersey. Governor of the state of New Jersey, as you all know, has more powers in the state, I think, than any other governor. It's a very important position. And now she chairs the Clean and Safe Energy Coalition.
Thank you very much. Well, in making predictions about 2013, that's a dicey proposition. The chances of getting anything right in this day and age are becoming more and more difficult. But one of the things I will say is that you have the Department of Energy calling for a 22% increase in power demand by 2035 in this country. That, as the head of our utility can tell us, is yesterday for the utilities and making some decisions. So what do I see for the future? Frankly, I think Fred is right. We're going to see an increased discussion on the issue of climate change, and it's going to be driven by the private sector and the state governments. The private sector, state and local governments have been, frankly, the laboratories of democracy, and you are going to see projects and new regulatory schemes come forward, more apt to see them come forward from the state and local level. Reference to Mike Bloomberg and talking about the reaction to Sandy. Look at what Governor Christie is going to have to face. We're going to have to face in Jersey on the shore. All of that is going to drive the ability to start talking about reducing our emissions. And that's going to get us to climate change. I don't think we're going to get to climate change with just a discussion of climate change. We've seen an unwillingness on the part of many members of the Congress to take that up. So what the utilities are going to have to look at and what we're going to look at for energy is frankly going to be a mix. It is an all-of-the-above strategy, which I know is frustrating to many Americans because nobody does it better than us when we're told there's one thing, if we do this one thing, everything will be okay. There's no such one thing for energy. It's going to demand all of them, and it has to be part of an overall understanding of how climate fits into that, and that fits into national security, it fits into our fiscal health, the fiscal health of this nation. I believe you're going to see more emphasis on renewables. You're going to see more emphasis on green power. Nuclear is going to continue to play a role, and with the Department of Energy having just issued its first agreement, public-private partnership to develop small modular reactors, that's going to help us move along because frankly you can locate those in places where the infrastructure isn't set up to handle a big reactor. But if you're looking for base power that's 24/7 that doesn't release regulated pollutants, nuclear is going to be part of that discussion. But we need to start with conservation. And I believe that because of the pressure that utilities are going to have, because of the pressure that private companies are going to have, that insurance companies face right now because of what they're having to pay for Sandy and the destruction of Sandy, they're going to bring the pressure and create the kind of climate that will allow Congress hopefully to act. Those would be my projections for this year.
And I'd like to pick up on what you said about New Jersey, first of all, before we go to a broader discussion on energy. New Jersey in 2013, enormous challenges, as I'm sure former governor, you would be monitoring that very closely. What can the state do about this devastated shoreline, given that it relies so heavily on tourism?
Well, it's going to be a huge challenge because tourism is our second largest industry in the state, and that is largely along the Jersey Shore, and that's just not going to be back where it was. We're going to rebuild, but my hope is that this opportunity will be used to rebuild smart in a sustainable way, and the governor has appointed someone who is going to honcho that, as it were, who is going to oversee that. The lieutenant governor has the state plan within her auspices, under her purview. And between the two of those, my hope is that we understand that while we want to rebuild those communities, many of them have been there for decades and people have grown up and spent their entire life at the shore and coming to the shore, we're not going to be able to rebuild them in the same way. And we're not going to be able to continue to rebuild because we are going to see more of these storms. This wasn't just a one-off.
Okay, well, we have a limited time but enormous territory to cover. One place to start, I think, is the amazing revolution that seems to have crept up all of a sudden in America in energy through unconventional gas and oil. And the report just lately that the United States would in a small number of years, become the world's biggest oil producer again, overtaking Saudi Arabia and Russia. What are the implications of this from your various perspectives. First of all, Marvin, perhaps you could say, do you see energy independence by the United States or North America as a whole in the very near future?
Well, I think what's becoming clear is the resources that would enable that appear to be there. Now, whether or not it's the right thing to do or whether or not the U.S. and North America chooses to move to self-sufficiency, I think is a completely different question. So one of the things that I would like to have predicted is that in 2012, the U.S. would actually develop an energy policy and have an energy strategy in this country. Some of that is clearly going to involve developing some of this natural gas and these unconventional oil resources. But how much, I think, will largely be a matter of policy.
Yeah. And Fred, from your point of view, are you relaxed about this whole upsurge of the fracking industry? It seems to have happened so fast. Or are there, in other parts of the world, there are very big misgivings about it. France has temporarily banned it and so on.
Relaxed is not the word I would have chosen. This has become an extraordinarily contentious issue. One of the reasons it's been contentious is because there are impacts on the communities, and too often, up until now, many companies, and Shell has been an exception to this, but many companies have denied there are any impacts. So the community sees their water contaminated, not necessarily by the fractures, but by spills on the surface or wells that haven't been drilled properly and cement casings that fail. Communities see their water getting contaminated by natural gas operations. Industry says, well, it's not the fractures. I visited in Washington, Pennsylvania, 30 minutes south of Pittsburgh, as part of President Obama asked Secretary Chu to appoint 7 of us to chart a safe path forward on shale. I visited there with a woman who told our commission that she had been forced to abandon her family farm because of the noxious emissions from the neighboring wells. Her son, in order to continue to go to school, was living with a neighbor. She was living out of her car. No one in this country should be forced to trade their health for cheap energy. The good news is that we are beginning to see states, mostly the states, begin to put the rules in place to protect communities and to protect the public health. That is critical to EDF's involvement in this issue. We are going to frack a lot of shale and a lot of other formations. It's just a fact of life. 90% of oil wells are being hydraulically fractured. We've got to get tough rules in place that protect folks. And the last thing I would say on this is that there's another issue that, in addition to these local impacts, is very serious and hasn't been paid much attention to, and that's the global issue of fugitive methane. Natural gas is mostly methane. These fugitive emissions from the wells, from the pipelines. If you have over 3.5% emissions, you actually, when you use natural gas instead of coal, that would be worse for the climate than coal. EPA thinks we're at 2.5%, but nobody really knows. And so Shell and several other companies are joining with us to go out and measure what the emissions are. And while I'm at it, I not only want to thank Shell for being willing to cooperate on getting to the science, but as I told Marvin before we stepped out on stage, in Colorado, just repeatedly now, Shell has been there calling for stronger regulations of its own industry, agreeing with EDF on how to go forward in a way that really is very meritorious. So I just want to thank you, Marvin, for what Shell is doing on this topic.
And Governor Whitman, you mentioned that there would need to be a mix of energy, and you mentioned nuclear. Is there a danger that the extraordinary growth of unconventional gas and oil in America creates a sense of abundance and no longer a need to worry about renewables that Marvin talked about and nuclear, for example?
It's certainly having an impact on investment and research and development. There's no question about it. It has slowed down. There were something like 17 nuclear reactors being considered just to keep us at 20%. Nuclear is 20% of our overall power mix today. That's backed off. We have 4 currently being built in the country, but you see that happening. And the thing we have to worry about, again, is putting all our eggs in one basket. We've been here before where natural gas was a very low cost. And then we saw the prices spike. It's not necessarily where you want to overinvest. We also don't know, there are emissions, it's a fossil fuel, so as we look at the issue of climate change and the need to control our greenhouse gases, we need to look at all those other forms of power that can give us the ability to, I'm not sure I would say we'd ever be energy independent because energy is fungible, it moves around the world, but we'd be certainly a lot less dependent on countries that don't like us. And it will have a impact, frankly, on our international policy and what we do in the Middle East, which of course is of grave concern to many, many people, and as well it should be. So right now, the cost of natural gas is certainly having an impact on the decision makers, on where you put your money and how fast you develop, but I think the utilities have been down this path before to the degree that they understand that it is going to be a mix. They're going to need to have a mix, and most of them do invest in other forms of power beyond just the natural gas.
Yeah, quickly, because we want to have time for...
Yeah, I think, and not to disagree with what's being said, but I think, someone who's been in this industry for the last 30 years and is actually a skeptic of resources and claims about how big they are and so forth, I will tell you that I think that the natural gas resources that have been found in this country are different than what we've seen ever before. And to go to Fred's point, if we do this the right way, and these resources won't get developed if they're not done the right way, but if we do them the right way, it is a new world from what we've seen in the past.
Okay. Questions for... Over on the... I've been a bit biased towards this side of the room, so let's have this side of the room. Yeah.
All right. So my question is, do you feel like the private sector could respond well to a policy designed to reorient their focus around developing cleaner forms of energy production, specifically something like a cap and trade or revenue-neutral carbon taxation plan? And what would that response look like?
Well, I mean, I can take a first stab, but then there are others who are more directly involved with it than I am. But clearly, the utilities are going to see a demand and a need. Right now, companies are seeing more and more shareholder proposals every annual meeting, asking them to benchmark their carbon footprint. And those are getting greater and greater votes. So companies are now seeing the ability to reduce their carbon footprint, the ability to reduce their reliance on water as good marketing tools and a way to distinguish themselves from others. And that's a positive reinforcement. So they can see that there is going to be actually some advantage to making these kinds of investments as they move forward. And I think that's a very good sign. You're going to see more of that, more attention to those things, because that's what their shareholders are starting to care about as they look at the overall economic impact that you have from superstorms like Sandy and the potential that these have been influenced, not caused by, but influenced by the climate change we've been seeing.
Let's take some more questions. There's one at the up at the end of the row there. Yeah.
Hi. I write about risk management and insurance, and believe it or not, for us, climate change is a really important topic. Because due to the drought and due to Sandy and big storms, it's affecting the solvency of insurance companies and the ability to offer affordable coverage. And we have been speaking to a lot of regulators, Washington, New York, Colorado, who are now agreeing that climate change is something that we really need to put forward as a national agenda. Same thing with associations. But at the same time, I was, for an article, I was speaking to the executives at a wind turbine manufacturing company. And the next week I spoke to them, and they had just lost half of their workforce. So we really do need to, pardon me, I have a cold. We really do need to think about the switch to alternate utilities, but at the same time, the state of those companies is not very strong. So do we need to put the agenda forward first, or do we need to develop strong alternate energy companies first?
Want to take that?
Maybe just take a quick initial stab at it, because I think I can tie these two together. So from a private sector standpoint, I think, taking advantage of the opportunity that's right in front of us, which is using market mechanisms to drive a change in the energy mix over time through a price on CO2, in my mind, ideally through a cap and trade system because it lowers the cost to everyone overall. But even if it took some form as a carbon tax, there's other ways to get there, is the important first step if you want to shift the energy mix, because then you get the full weight of all of that drive, investment, technology, and so forth moving in the right direction. I think it's more important than taking what feels like a little more one-off trying to hit specific sectors. It's just a smaller step and a harder way to get there.
Let's take another question. We have very limited time. In the middle of the back there. Yeah.
Thank you. Marvin, Shell's obviously driving the push into the Arctic. Can you talk a little bit about some of the environmentally sustainable things you're doing there? And Fred, maybe if you can talk about what do you think about the developing the Arctic from EDF's point of view? Thank you, gentlemen.
So really hard to do in 30 seconds, but let me just give a shot at it, and we'd have to find a way to have a longer conversation. First of all, it means you have to do the development part right. So you have to be efficient in how you use energy and the equipment you use and so forth. You have to do it in a way, and this is a long story behind it, in terms of protecting the environment when you explore for and then ultimately produce resources from a place like the Arctic. The drive behind it is a belief that the world will need these energy resources, and something like a quarter of the world's energy resources from an oil and gas perspective are in the Arctic. So that's in such a short period of time, that's really all I can tell you is it's all about doing that right. It's about the scrutiny from regulators and from all sorts of NGOs and outside parties about whether or not we're doing it the right way. But that's what supports the program.
Right.
Well, obviously the Arctic, I've been north of the Arctic Circle a couple of times, and it's a very fragile and precious place, and more of it is becoming accessible due, sadly, to the melting ice. So we've got to be extremely careful there because oil doesn't break up as fast if it spills up there as it does in warmer ecosystems. I might also say that those of us who think a lot about climate change, it's pretty easy to be depressed. It's pretty doom and gloomy when you see how fast this is coming on. It's coming on way faster than the scientists who work for me thought it would. Capitalism, when it doesn't have companies account for those external costs like the pollution, like the climate pollution, is what is driving this. We're here, the Economist, it's what the economists call externalities. The reason I'm hopeful...
But do you think we could have a carbon tax in America, for example?
I would like to see a price put on carbon linked to a cap on carbon that guarantees that we have reductions. To me, the trick isn't what the price is. The trick is we've got to get a system in place that mandates reductions. But that is why I'm hopeful, because when we try capitalism, when we put the incentives in place so that solar and wind power and geothermal have a level playing field, watch what happens. And in the rest of the world, in the European Union, now in China, 250 million people live in provinces that are trying cap and trade. In Australia, cap and trade. New Zealand, cap and trade. South Korea implementing a carbon system. We are moving in more and more places to a place where we do what Marvin and the governor have called for, where we use capitalism, get the incentives right, which we haven't until now done. And that makes me hopeful, because entrepreneurs harnessed to invent what we need to have a clean planet can give us a clean planet.
Final thought, Governor Whitman?
I would just echo, frankly, what they say, that the economic drivers are there. I do think it's going to happen at the state level. You already see California is doing a carbon auction. It's going to be the states that are going to drive it, as well as the multinational companies that want to have regimes in place that are harmonized with Europe. And Europe and the rest of the world are moving ahead of us as far as addressing the issue of carbon and carbon emissions. And it makes it difficult for companies to do business across country lines because they're subject to penalties by not meeting some of the requirements of other states, and it puts us into a very difficult position. So hopefully those are going to be the drivers that are going to get us there. I don't see much appetite right now for a carbon tax. We don't seem to like tax in any way, shape, or form. And so I don't know, but that's a pretty clean way to do it.
Your party might have advocated a tax or something.
Well,
No.
not all of my party.
Anyway, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for a fascinating discussion. Thank you.